Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to yet another exciting episode of The Vinnie Eastwood Show. It's the lighter side of genocide, because after all, just because we're being exterminated doesn't mean we can't make it fun. Otherwise, what's the point of being killed? My very special guest is Dr. Nick Begich, and I wanted to make the kind of a Simpsons joke, you know, get the whole audience. Hi, Dr. Nick! Welcome to the show, my friend.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening.
Now, this show might be a little bit different to the very serious broadcast that you may have been associated with previously. It's mostly just a conversation between two people, and the audience basically just gets to listen in. The one thing I'm really interested in hearing from you is sort of your origin story, how you got going, what your life has been like, the whole 9 yards. Start wherever you wish.
Well, that's kind of a broad question. Well, you know, in terms of science, as the last, I guess since '95, we've been talking about new technologies, privacy-related technologies. HARP was a big part of some of our original writing, but a lot of work in the sciences, just acting as, I think, more of a reporter than anything else, and compiling sort of the direction of science, where it was headed. And over the years, I think we've been proven pretty right on most of our projections.
And does it make you feel better or worse knowing that you're right?
Well, you know, I think, you know, in the conclusion of it all, I think when you look at science and sort of the impact of science on modern culture and society, you know, the impact is pretty much as predicted. I think there's symptomatic, you know, whether you look at environmental problems or military issues or political issues, underlying all that is really the issue of consciousness, I guess, where people, how we view the world, how we interact with each other, and ultimately that, I think, becomes the problem and maybe the solution. Everything else seems symptomatic of that.
I was having an argument. Oh, there seemed to be a bit of feedback. If you could perhaps turn your speakers down a little. If you just turn the volume down on them, it should solve the problem. Earlier, before the show, I was having an argument with a listener about the whole enemies and friends business. And I believe that there are true enemies to humanity, and there's a burden of responsibility upon those people who recognize it to go out and oppose them in order to protect everybody else, as it were. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, on a certain level, I think there's certain elements that get pretty reckless. So kind of containing the recklessness might be a way of looking at it. But ultimately, I think, again, you know, when you start thinking about these kinds of problems, they're symptomatic of really a lack of awareness, consciousness, really thinking about what we're doing and the impact of it. And a lot of it, you know, unfortunately, a lot of the destruction is sort of, I guess, driven by religion and driven by greed, if you really want to get down to it.
Would you say it's kind of like that triple partnership between London controlling the money, the Vatican controlling the ecclesiastical power, and the United States controlling the military, that those three elements have more or less brought humanity into a very dark fold?
Well, I think you can say that, but I think if you look at all religion, I mean, on one level or another, you know, contains the elements of the same things. Government, whether it's the U.S. or other governments, contain elements of the same thing. And banking or moneyed interest, or the medium between exchanges, you know, and how that gets regulated, and sort of the arbitrage in that by corporations or other moneyed interest. You know, if you think about it, you know, the titles change over time, but the interests really don't change a whole lot when you think about it, whether it's, you know, whatever caused the revolution, whether it was a few hundred years ago, few thousand years ago, or tomorrow. You know what I mean? I mean, it seems to drive by the same thing. So the Vatican holds huge power. U.S. in terms of military power dwarfs everyone else. Although, if you really think about it, maybe that's not so or won't be so for very long, because a lot of that is driven by an analysis of sort of expenditures. The U.S. spends so much more money than everyone else. But if you look at it from the standpoint of what do you get for that money? I mean, what do you get in output? And I think that's maybe a better measure. So measure outputs in finished ships and military readiness, say from China compared to the U.S., and you get about a 10-to-1 difference in terms of outward productivity in terms of hardware from China, as an example.
Well, if you're talking about these negative influence on society, I'm thinking about a common thread here. It's in exchange for blind belief, you're supposed to get power. Right?
Well, maybe that's so. I think a lot of it's driven by fear, if you think about it, whether it's religion driving the fear or government driving the fear, but that becomes maybe blind belief or sort of the flight and fight response. Maybe that's a way of looking at it.
Well, what was it? Sacrificing your liberties in exchange for security, and you often wind up with neither.
Right, exactly right. In fact, I think you do wind up with neither, because ultimately your liberty and your personal freedom, there's a certain insecurity in that, if you will. There's certain uneasiness or natural tension sort of built into that, I think.
Well, it's implying that there's natural risk in life anyway.
Yeah, I think that's it. And, but when you look at, sort of the intentionality behind a lot of the military things that I've reported on over the years, a lot of it is about control and manipulation and those things. And when you think about government and what it's become, it's so, different than what I think anybody envisioned. When you lay technology on top of government or anything. And when you think about technology in terms of power, just raw power, what makes governments powerful in the 21st century really is technology, if you think about it, command and control of technology. So when you think about that as a concept, how many people in government really have knowledge of that at a level where they can regulate it properly?
This is why they have panels of advisors who incidentally represent all the technology companies that are coming up with this stuff that kills people.
Right. Well, not only that, but in Congress, they get closed committee hearings, right? They get briefed by Pentagon people and people on the inside. They can't take advisors. They can't take aides. They can't make notes. They can't discuss it with anyone outside of the room. So how does a non-scientist even ask the right questions in that environment? And they're expected to regulate it. I mean, it's like, how do you do that? I mean, and I don't think you can under that circumstance. And that's the circumstance that the U.S. government's under, which leads sort of the charge on technologies with nobody in the Senate or Congress to speak of with enough depth and science to really even ask the right questions.
This reminds me of the politically naive reporters who ask the president questions during press conferences.
Right. The same thing, if you don't have a good basis, you can't ask the right questions, right? So, who gets in the room and gets to ask is always sort of the outcome of bad reporting. But again, going back to technology, when you think about the temptation, and this is where, again, I think the politics and the money rub up against maybe what's in the best human interest, and that's that idea of control. When you think about what now you can do with information, virtually everything is connected. Your financial, your health, your voting, just think of all the electronic records that surround one individual over a lifetime that can be collated and indexed and reviewed and thought about, from your phone calls to your digital connections. And when you think about that in the terms of politics, what is going to happen and is happening is as the resolution, if you will, as the intensity of the resolution gets better, you can deduce more and more about average people or individual people within a population. And then you can tailor your political messages, and this is where it's headed and where it is, tailor it to an individual where you got 100 issues and there's only one that you're going to agree on with that individual. The other 99 you don't. but you can bring your messaging in so that's the only message they ever see, or at least it's contained as much as possible. So when you think about politics and the framework of it and sort of how decision making is moved and popular ideas are moved, that's wherein lies a great deal of danger. When you think of a free press without the responsibility of sort of a better dimension of who owns that information and what is it that represents personal privacy in the 21st century.
Influencing popular culture to buy into this idea, I think sometimes dystopian sci-fi films are very revealing. Just last year there was a Marvel film called Captain America the Winter Soldier, and spoiler alert for those listening, in it they had these giant helicarriers which had these precision guns on them that could eliminate 1,000 people a minute. And they had run an algorithm across the entire human race, and every single thing that they've ever done, their bank records, their SAT scores, their voting patterns, their medical records, banking histories, you name it, has been used to predict people's future, and their plan was to save the world by taking out 20 million people who might oppose them.
Well, it's interesting. But when you think about data banking and just sort of how information's stored, and people say, oh, and this is kind of the standard thing is, oh, it's no problem because if you don't have anything to hide. But it's never about what is today. It's about what is unknown in terms of tomorrow. You know, what becomes a government that you might oppose today that becomes the power of tomorrow. But all that data is stored. And the idea is that, again, when you store a lot of information, people think, well, it's not a problem until it is a problem, right? And so ultimately, it's about who owns your data. And when you think about personal privacy in the context of your home, it's easy. You know, the front door represents the threshold, but your digital doorway in the 21st century represents a greater threshold of personal privacy, and really ultimately the interference with liberty. And I think that's where we kind of need to sort of evaluate where we're headed and what we're doing, and then looking at in terms of outcomes. What are we doing in the planet that could be done in a different way? Because we have all these great systems now, all this great technology, maybe being applied more to entertainment than to making positive change or positive effect in the world. Even when you think about just how much money is spent these days on high technology.
I created a meme just the other day. You have nothing to fear if you have nothing to hide. And that's a quote from Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda.
Right.
And I said, bro, if your government is using lines from this guy, you're in trouble, son.
Yeah, right. Exactly right. And, when you think about it, what the idea of free thinking was really what it fundamentally, and the lack of interference by government or outside interest when you're kind of minding your own business and allowed to think freely. And when you think about the interconnectedness of information, it really runs sort of against that or counter to that. When you think about sort of the idea of shortage and overpopulation, this idea that there's not enough, really, I think there is. Quite frankly, I think there's enough to make a pretty successful planet. And again, it gets back down to intentionality. When you think about how much is spent on various things in parts of the world, you say the U.S. as far as military dominance, no doubt about it. Right now in the 21st century, that's where it is. Vatican controlling vast amounts of power and wealth, no doubt about it. Private banking really driven into a few hands holding enormous power, no doubt about it. And when you think about then what's under that, and multinational corporations that take advantage of tax laws and loopholes will essentially pay nothing for the advantage of protection by the U.S. military and its allies. And a banking system.
It seems to me like a very sophisticated shell game where instead of just having one front and maybe two different front men to distract anybody from your real intentions, you have hundreds of fronts, thousands of front men.
Maybe that's it. I think it's maybe a more of a, kind of the Chamber of Commerce of bad intention. Maybe that's the way to look at it. When you think about people's general self-interest and how they align them, it's and now with information, the advent of so much information, how easy is it to push all that along? And like here in the U.S., the last elections, I mean, in Alaska, where I live, where there's just a few 100,000 voters on the U.S. Senate race, $60 million got spent, which is an enormous sum of money when you stop and think about it. And most of it from people who don't even live here, in terms of being resident in this place and trying to influence its outcomes and doing it. When you think about moneyed interest in government as an example, wow, what an influence. Try and go see your congressman or U.S. senator as an average citizen. You might get a 30-second, a minute photo op and in and out, But if you lay out a $5,000 or $10,000 campaign contribution, I guarantee you'll get a conversation, maybe even lunch, And the sad part of that is it's institutionalized. In other countries where they call that bribery, here we call it a campaign contribution. You know what I mean? But it really kind of results in the same thing, right? Influence, access, outcomes.
What was it? Bill Hicks was one time reading this porno magazine, and it has this disclaimers that said all of our models are over 18, and he goes, "Oh, these are models all of a sudden."
Well, I guess it's all a matter of perspective, right? And maybe that's it. So when you think about all of that, think about moneyed interest in elections and what happens, the frustration people have with government right now. I don't care where you live. A lot of it's just driven by sort of the patchwork quilt of politics and public policy. It doesn't make a lot of sense because it just serves a bunch of special interest rather than serve a public purpose. And maybe that's what gets lost in some of this.
Switching gears now, I'd like to change the topic to more exotic technologies. And I've been made aware that you're kind of familiar with the HARP program, but of course I have not done enough research to quantify. So if you'd explain briefly your involvement and perhaps your thoughts on the HARP machine, I'd be very much obliged.
Well, HARP was where a lot of the work I got involved with publicly started. It was a high frequency and is the high frequency active Aurora research project, which was originally an Air Force and Navy project here that eventually went to DARPA and now kind of gets funded intermittently by different agencies. But it was a developmental prototype that was designed to focus radio frequency energy in kind of a unique way to create a number of weapons effects here in Alaska. And as a result of sort of our reporting on that, we ended up reporting on a lot of areas of technology. This one was pretty interesting. It was developed originally by a guy named Dr. Bernard Eastland, who passed away in 2007. But he had invented a system, a phased array, a field of antennas that would focus radio frequency energy into the upper ionosphere or ionosphere above the Earth's surface, maybe 30 miles out or more, and affect that region and also affect the magnetic field lines that surround the Earth and create a number of weapons effects by just being able, think about the revolution of light when you think of lasers, in terms of how the different applications of lasers by focusing light energy into a relatively small or narrow beam. The idea of pushing or focusing radio frequency energy into a relatively small area as opposed to it spreading out, which is its natural tendency, the same as light. he figured out how to do that, how to create this focused energy that could then be manipulated for over-the-horizon radar, for weather manipulation, even for modulating the ionosphere, this energetic layer surrounding us, in such a way as to act as a broadcast antenna, sending signals back to the Earth and sea.
And exactly what kind of effects would you be able to have? I mean, are there multiple different kinds of effects or only just a number?
Sure. Like a couple different things, different ideas that came out of the research. The more interesting things like over-the-horizon radar, being able to bounce a signal over the horizon to pick up everything from, say, intercontinental ballistic missiles at really high elevations down to things like cruise missiles coming in very low. You could use it for that. You could modulate the jet stream in such a way as to cause it to move around a bit and create some changes in sort of weather patterns or anomalies in pretty distant places. You could do you could modulate a signal off of the ionosphere that could then penetrate the Earth and sea for communication with submarines, or for what was called and demonstrated to be Earth penetrating tomography. This is like, by analogy, would be like X-raying the Earth or looking into the Earth several kilometers deep for underground facilities or mineral deposits or water, oil, natural gas, these kinds of things, minerals. You could do with this kind of imaging uh, by utilizing something like HARP. You could also manipulate the physiology of living organisms by manipulating energy in very specific ways, including human beings. So when you think about radio frequency and the idea of manipulating it for different purposes, HARP became sort of a development, was and is a developmental prototype for exploring some of these concepts.
Could we backtrack a little and talk about some of the possible effects that you could do on humans?
Yeah, if you go back, in fact, if you go back even further, go back to J.F. Gordon MacDonald. There was a book written by Zbigniew Brzezinski when he was at Columbia University, and he quotes this guy. And MacDonald was a geophysicist, and he was a science advisor to Lyndon Johnson when he was president of the United States on science. And at UCLA, he was writing back in the 60s. In 69, he published a chapter called "How to Wreck Your Environment" in a book at the time. And in this, he talked about the idea of, if we could ever figure out how to electronically stroke the ionosphere in just the right way, we could return a signal to the Earth that would manipulate the behavior of people within that signal range. And what he was referring to or alluding to is the idea of creating a frequency following response, or an FFR, where the brain will lock onto an external signal within certain window frequencies and begin to mirror it or become entrained or lock into that signal in such a way that your general emotional state over large areas of probably 70, maybe even as many as 80% of the population might be affected in this way, where you essentially can change the emotional state of large segments of the population, as an example.
Could it be used to make people, I don't know, dumb, stupid or something? Because there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that there's...
Well, let's say this. You could generate fear like what you saw in the first war in Iraq. If you remember the levels of fear that were generated in one of the systems that were used back then, that was reported in Scottish media, was something very similar, where they actually piggybacked a signal on the radio broadcasts going into the region, the ones broadcasting Muslim music and prayers and so on. And what they would do is piggyback a signal that would generate this underlying sense of stress or anxiety. And the result of that was it just amplified the effect of the bombardment and the war, and caused that system to collapse pretty rapidly. If you think about the fourth largest army in the world in that first conflict, how fast that was concluded.
Are there limits to its effect? It can influence people. Can it control them?
Well, I don't know how far it's really gone. We report on what's been published. There was some interesting developments in terms of how far it goes. There was two DARPA contracts that were led a couple of years ago to the University of California on the concept of, for instance, electronic telepathy, the idea of being able to look at brain activity with an individual and be able to look at the complex signals coming from that, and then being able to read or analyze those signals into some kind of output, so you literally knew what a person was thinking, and then taking it the next step and being able to replicate that signal, that complex signal, and send it into another brain to see if you could literally transfer thoughts. I mean, that's where the research right now is headed. In between that and where it's gone, say since the 50s, when our government first started, at least getting pretty heavily engaged in this. And it goes even back further back to the research at Harvard University in the 1920s and 30s, when the first hypnotherapy labs were being established.
And in your experience researching into these fields, does the military discover things and not announce them until long after they've got them in working order and production and even in use?
Oh, generally speaking, I would say that's right. Or at least you see some, you kind of see the early stages of this in the RFPs, the request for proposals, what the government goes out and looks for within its funding that it at least opens to the public, basic research initiatives, these kinds of things. And you see, some of that gives you at least directionally where it's headed. How far it's gone, you never really see that until usually decades after. I mean, a lot of the things in the, for instance, in the mind control research goes back to the 50s and 60s and into the 70s from the church committee hearings in the early 70s. And a lot of that is what continues to be quoted to this day. And little bits and pieces, eventually make their way out under various Freedom of Information Act requests, and people connect the dots little by little, but usually decades later after the research was long concluded.
So just to be safe, assume that it's a lot worse than you could ever imagine.
That's probably a safe bet. In terms of how especially in the areas of privacy, if people think that they have any personal privacy, it's naive. In the 21st century, you have none. The presumption of personal privacy should be zero. So start with that, because that's really the state of the technology in that area. Now, when you start to go beyond that, walking through airports, looking at personalities, just facial expressions, with about 65, 70% accuracy, you can pick out all kinds of stressors that maybe narrow the population of who you want to look at. When you start to think about facial recognition and other systems that are increasingly more sophisticated and more efficient, privacy is really a lost thing, the way information is regulated and stored and managed.
I saw an interesting article not some time ago that said that facial recognition systems don't work if you're black.
Oh, that's interesting. Whether that's true or not, I would wonder about that a bit, just because of the sophistication of systems. When you think again of resolution, at one point in time we said, oh, you can't broadcast energy wirelessly for more than a few millimeters, and then it was meters, and then it was kilometers. And when you think about technology again, it's like doubling from the invention of the wheel to where we are today about every 6 or 7 months. I mean, imagine what the capabilities are. I mean, a couple big areas that make huge leaps in where we are. Quantum computing versus supercomputing. Supercomputing, take everybody on the planet with a hand calculator for about 60 hours making a calculation every few seconds, and you still get to a supercomputer's second of computing, right? But take a supercomputer for an hour and compare it to uh, a quantum computer. And the difference is a trillion years of supercomputer equals an hour of quantum computer. When we make that next leap, which is some say we've already made it, it means that all encryption systems become obsolete. Your ability to do predictive models is never perfect, but it gets really close. And we rely then on these computers more and more, and yet they don't quite get it right.
Well, I was just thinking about that in terms of all the infinite combinations of passwords, codes, uppercase, lowercase, etc., and how many attempts at cracking a password could you get into a short amount of time. Just using that analogy of the whole world using calculators for an hour equals one supercomputer, and then one quantum computer is like a trillion years or whatever, something ridiculous. It'll probably even get even more ridiculous as time goes on.
Right.
So that's why, because of the power that is now being developed through technology, anything that people can really conceive of to protect their information is obsolete. If it's hooked up to anything, anywhere, at any time, it's at risk.
Yeah, and here's the thing. Now they're looking at ways to pick your brain, so to speak. I mean, think about that. Because think about it, you're really, what is a human being able to do with sound, with light, with the various inputs of energy, which is part of the electromagnetic spectrum? Just think of yourself as a tuner that just gets a little resolution within a little narrow bandwidth. When you think of how narrow the frequency range in which we hear or we see light or perceive light, it's pretty narrow on that spectrum of sensing, if you will. So when you think about resolution and impact, we're really only sensing a small part of the whole game plan directly, when you think about it. I mean, on an energetic level. So when you start playing with all those systems, and then you don't really think about how do they connect up to other living organisms, including us, either as direct assaults or indirect assaults on our health. These are things that aren't even considered in the evolution of our technology until you get to the point of saying, hey, can we manipulate our physiology, our bodies in a way using just raw energy? And here's the interesting thing. On a military side, the answer is absolutely yes for destruction. But on a health-related side, the answer is yes as well. When you start to think about the same root concepts, feed both directions in technology, how to damage humans or how to recognize the underlying mechanisms that make human beings healthy.
I saw a advertisement on a couple of my mates showed me this for Windows glasses and holograms. Now, if you walk around your kitchen, imagine that you can put boxes of holograms and things and place them around your kitchen. You can change the wallpaper, you can change the backgrounds and all of that kind of stuff, all while you've got your glasses on, and you can actually touch and move things fully like that. I was like, whoa, that's amazing. Imagine what I could do, I'll jump into my office, right, and I'll change the background of the walls so that it looks like a giant receding forest line or something like that. So I could be inside in my office and feel like I'm in a forest, right? And then a really terrible thought hit me. My God, you could so easily force people to accept horrible living conditions if they've got something to distract them from it.
Well, that's an interesting thought, isn't it? When you think about distraction generally, and there was a very good friend of mine. One of the last books he left me was before he passed on was the Unreality Industry, and it was an older book. It was two PhDs talking about sort of the evolution of entertainment. And when you think about virtual reality, reality TV, I mean, all of the feeds of data that people get and what you choose within that feed to be your propaganda, if you will. But it moves mountains. Think about the outcomes of all of that. That's why advertising works. That's why a lack of discretion can go a long way. When you think about television, the flicker rate, just the rate in which the vibration comes to the eyes can place a person in almost a trance-like state. In fact, think about the person sitting in front of the TV set watching a show and their spouse or significant other starts hollering at them, hey, hey, dinner's ready, and they don't even hear it. They're not even there, right? Well, what's going on? Well, if you look at the brain activity of that individual, what you'll see is they're almost in fact, they are in a light trance-like state where they're not watching the program, they are the program. They're being programmed. And excluding all the external stimulus while that programming is going on. That's why you don't hear the other person hollering at you. That's the state you're in. And when does it happen usually? People go to work, they work all day, they sit in the stressful environments with light flickering at them at 60 cycles a second in the US or 60 hertz through fluorescent fixtures and other parts of the grid. They've got more EMF coming at them, creating an underlying stress that's usually only fully perceived when the power goes out. And we have that happen frequently in parts of the US. So your power grid goes down and you notice how quiet it is. But the other thing you notice is your whole body contracts as you relax, as you finally feel that your body can find an equilibrium without counterbalancing for all of the energy coming at you in urban areas every second of the day. And then when you get home and you're fatigued and you're sitting in front of the television, now you're getting a flicker rate that might be in the 7 or 8 hertz pulses per second range, a light theta state, where you're literally being programmed with the ads and news propaganda and whatever other feed you're subjecting yourself to at that moment.
That is why they call it a programming schedule.
Yeah, I think that is. And you know, when you think about the big networks, it's CBS, you know, so what are you doing? You're seeing it. You're seeing the BS.
Yeah. There's CBS and PBS, and I want to create a new news network that's just called BS.
There you go. You know, but it is funny when you think about it, because really, when you think about the effect of all that, and then if you add into this at some point the stimulation to fear, really good reasoning goes out the window. Then you're just kind of herded along. So when you think about how media works, what it really does, and you know, all of this was supposed to give us a what did they say in the '60s? A more leisurely society. Instead, people work harder for less than they ever did before. Although they're entertained at a pretty high level.
I was just thinking about this. The mainstream media programs you to be afraid of things that really don't matter, and the alternative media tells you about things that you should really be afraid of.
Maybe that's it. But maybe the thing is we shouldn't be afraid of any of it. We should just recognize that.
Maybe it's the fact that we don't understand it is why we're afraid of it. We don't know how to counteract it. It's like the unfamiliar and the indefensible are two things which I believe fear comes as the first response.
Yeah, I think that's right. And maybe the best, I think in looking at all this, you know, as I look around the world and travel quite a bit over the last 20 years on these topics and a lot of others, and met a lot of people on the way, and my conclusions on most of it is the fear gets in the way of the real solutions, because there's a lot of people doing interesting things in other directions. When you think about health sciences, when you think about politics, and people just getting more informed as time goes on. And I think it eventually reaches a threshold where there's some sense of revolution, not necessarily a violent thing, but definitely a change. And we see that pop out in various ways at different times in history. And
if there is going to be any violence, it'll come from the people who currently have all the guns.
Yeah, well, yeah, maybe that's true. And you know, and at least in some parts of the world, that's most of the people that live here, you know. So, you know, it's who knows? You know, I think maybe there's a different way of seeing it. Maybe there's a different paradigm coming, and I think maybe there is, that sort of goes beyond the normal violent acts.
I was talking to Benjamin Fulford the other day, and he said very similar words to what Nelson Mandela said when they were taking back South Africa from the whites. No reprisals, no punishment, no nothing. You just yield your power and you get to live in peace. That's the deal.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, there's something about that. You know, maybe even going further than that is at some point, society and culture deserves the truth, and maybe the truth commission concept of forgiveness. Come forward, tell us what really happened, let us address that, and we can forgive that. But don't come forward and don't tell us, and we find out, and then whatever the full extent of the law is, that can be applied to you should be applied. But maybe forgiveness is the best route to the truth. Maybe Mandela had it right, and ultimately that's what was going on in South Africa. From my
I mean, think about this. You can either A, have murderers and thieves and sociopathic pedophile scum in charge, or B, you can have those murderers and sociopaths and scumbags living in a mansion somewhere away from everybody and having no power.
Yeah, I mean, really. I mean, ultimately, and in some cases, they don't yield, and then they have their punishment now. But I think ultimately, maybe there's something to be said for that. To end it, to change it, to alter the direction of the planet, it takes a change of consciousness. My thoughts about Judgment Day. Everybody talks about Judgment Day, whatever your persuasion is. Maybe Judgment Day is the day that we perceive each other's thoughts clearly. Wouldn't that be something? Wouldn't that be opening the book of life if you knew what everybody truly thought and experienced?
Well, that's what I try to do with my show, is just like, I'm not going to judge you or second guess you during the broadcast, mate. That's just rude. Just tell us what you know and go for your life, son.
Well, and think about it, though. Think about this from this perspective. If that were Judgment Day, wouldn't that require a great deal of self-forgiveness and forgiveness of others? I mean, ultimately, maybe
require
that's
a lot of honesty, I think.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's where it begins. Transparency. We talk about that in government. We hear that all the time. Maybe that begins with individuals as well. And the idea of forgiveness, the idea of letting some of the BS go and try and find a way through this, because there is enough. I think when you look around the world and you travel around the world and you see what's here, there's maybe it's more about leaving people alone to explore their own sort of self-determination. Maybe it needs to be more about that, less about sort of a multinational sort of view of the world, and maybe a little bit more respect for the possibilities.
There was a documentary called Rich Man's Trick, and in it they said that, basically, I think it was like 80 people controlled 99% of the world's wealth or something like that, something ridiculous.
Yeah.
And what it means is that those people can live the life of billionaires, whereas there is enough money, there is enough resources, and there is enough technology where everybody could live that similar lifestyle if it was all shared. But the problem is, these people, like the royal family and what have you, they wouldn't be wanting to wait in line at an advanced tube station with everybody else, would they? No, they'd have their own private jet, and this way they don't actually have to associate or be part of the world.
There's something to be said for the extremes of it all, but at the same time, there's enough, and I guess that's the point: is how we do this. How much is spent to preserve the wealth of the few? And yet, if you weren't spending it, preserving it out of fear, right? I mean, because ultimately it's about control. Again, it gets back to that same consciousness question that underlies the problems, whether they're military conflict or accumulations of wealth that aren't deployed in ways that really create anything anymore. In fact, they end up being just a sponge that sucks from everything else. When you think about even the richest in the world pay the lowest percentage in taxes.
Yeah.
What's that about?
I think it's because they control the world, so they set the tax rates.
I mean, but really, think about it. If it were just on an equitable basis,
I think maybe the great mistake of good people is thinking that those who are doing really terrible things are also good people, simply making a mistake, where in some cases these are actually really, really sick people who are dangerous and who will not have the same desires or level of satisfaction as somebody else would.
Yeah, and it's a question of values and how people view the world. And you think about the biggest mass murderers have been leaders of countries, for God's sake. I mean, stop and think about it. You're talking about sociopathic governments and paranoid people. Think about what's been wiped out in terms of living human beings by government historically. It's the root of really a lot of evil when you stop and think about it. And, again, what are the possibilities in the 21st century? Technology is a two-edged sword in my estimation. We try to reflect what nature can do, what man can do. And we can either deliver mail with the airplane or deliver the next bomb, right? It depends on the intention of the operator. And I think that's really again, gets back down to how do we make sure that the interest of liberty, freedom, the value systems that are common to humanity, what we think of as our, God-given creative rights, preserved in an era of technology such as ours. And those questions are not adequately being answered. In fact, we're being violated in ways that nobody ever contemplated a few hundred years ago, for sure.
Dr. Nick Begich is my guest, ladies and gentlemen. You're listening to the Vinnie Eastwood Show on American Freedom Radio. We're going to take a quick break now, and we'll be right back. Don't you touch that dial. And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to hour number 2 of the fastest 2 hours in talk radio. It's the Vinnie Eastwood Show. It's the lighter side of genocide, because in a world so full of chaos and madness, if you lose your sense of humour, you'll go friggin' nuts. And my very special guest is Dr. Nick Begich, coming at us from virtually the end of the world. And that happens to be the subject matter. Welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me. Hey, it is. We were talking during the break about, where are we at the moment? And you're in New Zealand, I'm in Alaska. Kind of the opposite ends of the world. It is amazing, what you can do with technology. We're doing this radio show from literally for around the world, from around the world. I love it, and I'm like I was saying, I'm the second to last guy who still has internet before we hit an area the size of West Virginia that's empty, and you can look around from my place and see 10 kilometers and not see the sign or hear the sound of another living soul, which is kind of nice, when you think about it. The world has really got a lot of open place and open space still, at least in my part of the world, certainly, and much of the world that I've seen.
And people don't realize that if they're stuck in a city. And the city to rural ratio has really, really gone downhill. I mean, in terms of the amount of urbanization, we're talking about in the Great Depression of the 1930s, 10 million people in the United States starved to death. And that was during a time when 90% of people lived in rural areas and grew their own food. Today, 90% of people live in cities and do not grow their own food.
Right. And now we call that food organic produce. We used to call it food, right? When you think about that, just in terms of how we function, the world can still produce a tremendous amount. In fact, more than ever before per acre, we can produce tremendous amounts of food. And yet we tend to focus that in large commercialized farms now, not the small family farm of 100 years ago. But the idea of urban farming even is coming into vogue. Here in Alaska and Anchorage, they're actually starting one of these vertical farms indoors that have really high yields, high production because of all the things you can apply, in terms of growing systems. Think about that as it gets applied more and more around the world. Again, good application of technology, high density food growth.
A friend of mine, I was talking to at a party a number of years ago, and he was doing advanced robotics at a tech here in Auckland, and they had a growing rotating splint with an LED light supply above it. So you'd put your seedlings into the holes of the splint and have an automatic water feeding system. And the splint would then rotate with the LED light display in one direction up above them. And what they found was these seedlings would start growing towards the light, and because they're being rotated slowly, they grow up to 700% faster.
Yeah, in fact, when you start to apply the right frequency of light for specific plants, because just a slight change gets you higher yields as well. And then when you look at LEDs for low energy input, and when you start talking about that kind of productivity, and then you look at vertical farming, which again uses the full height of rooms and even the excess heat from lighting to keep rooms, temperate for growing. But I think that's again where you start to think about, sort of the application of technology. We look at sort of how do we change all this in a way that might be even more productive and more useful. And when you start to think about technologies, the ones that we've had in the past have made us dependent. Think about us plugging into the grid, if you will. Things that used to be free, like television, now cost you money. When you think about the internet or any of your other connectivity, um,
I think
has
if you're going to think about dependence, think about people's dependence on their cell phones and how many numbers they can still remember.
right, right, and and if you're think about disconnecting in a way that allows you to still be connected, you want energy. Well, we should be self-sustaining in energy by now, and I think we can be. Even with what people acknowledge are the technologies on the planet today. The idea of hydrocarbon systems continuing to be propagated. And, when you think about what's going on in those markets right now and you talk about manipulation, oh my gosh,
Well, think
think
about
about,
the suppression of advanced fuel technology. Even the vaporizing carburetor that was getting like 200
yes,
miles per gallon and like what
right,
was it, the 40s, 50s, 60s, something like that, gets
right,
suppressed. And it turns out that the only reason why there's pollution of any kind coming out your tailpipe is because of unburned hydrocarbons. We're being made to use engines that are inefficient and give off waste.
right, right. And, when you think about all of that, you start thinking about, what are the real alternatives and how do you develop those and how do you incentivize that? And you got to change the whole business model from the one that says, how do you keep everybody coming back and being dependent to how do you reward creating independence where people can disconnect from some of these systems and be independent? Because
I've
in the 21st century, energy is a primary, it's like air, you got to have it, right?
It seems that there is a need for a new business model, and instead of having one bottom line, one business that I've heard of called Life Force International has three. So their production of their products has to be completely sustainable. You only take what you can and allow it to regrow. And the second part is it has to actually be really good for the customer. And the third bottom line is obviously just to make a profit.
Yeah, yeah. And the idea of all that, and what does that generate? Profit generates an opportunity to do something again, right? And in generally, if it's storing wealth, think about that. How much wealth is stored up that sort of stops the system from working? It really needs to be deployed. And I think that's where people confuse money with wealth. Wealth is entrepreneurship, labor, land and natural resources, and machinery that makes things. That's what true wealth is. Those are the factors of economic production. And currency is the medium that gets those things moving. And if you deploy those in ways that serve our interests better, I think that's then you have the opportunity for technology to serve us in a different way.
However, if you control the issuance of that currency, it means you can buy all of the real wealth.
Yeah, yeah. And you think about that in terms of what really happens on the planet and who consolidates it, and under the illusion of liberty, safety, security, freedom, whatever you want to, wave your flag around. But ultimately, we've just traded different forms of slavery, in my estimation, because most of what we're capable of, whether it's our on the spiritual side or the emotional or physical side of life, are suppressed by fears, whether religion drives it, government drives it, or those who prefer to keep everything to themselves drives it, or greed, if you will. And not that, there's a whole philosophy even that, I forget, it's the Rand philosophy of greed is good, right? And what does that mean? What are they really saying in that? I mean, what does that mean? I think it means that self-interest really does govern what happens on the planet, and maybe ultimately redefining what that might look like changes the planet and how our technologies are applied, how our natural resources are applied. You think about the wealth of natural resource, hydrocarbons alone. If you do them right, you can do them well. You don't have to blow it out the tailpipe, right? You can do this differently, and there's enough to go a very, very long time in terms of wealth of the world and hydrocarbons.
I saw an interesting study that was conducted where they got a whole bunch of students in, and their goal was to do this little map thing and engage in a mock trucking service. Your goal is to deliver the goods from point A to point B. However, between point A and point B, there are two different routes. One is really, really long and has no gates, and the other is really, really short but has two gates. And they did a number of different experiments between contestant A and contestant B to see who could make the most money and how. And they determined that it's only when both trucking companies operate a gate and allow both of themselves through and don't try to impinge on other people in terms of competition. Cooperation is more profitable than competition.
That's interesting. That's interesting. When you think about again, self-interest. If you can address everyone's interest in the course of putting the deal together, as some say, where everybody wins. I think you can. I think most things are resolvable. Most conflict is. If it's transparent, open dialogue, you can get to rational finish lines in most cases. When you think about so much of what drives bad outcomes is what's hidden from us. If we actually knew what was happening within our governments, within our economies, if we really thought about it,
there'd be a revolution before morning.
It would be so much. People would be amazed. They would be grinding their teeth, for sure. But again, maybe that day will come. I hope it does.
Are there two? I've defined two specific reactions to this, like figuring out the way the world works. One is a close-off reaction. I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to do it. Basically, it's a fear reaction. And the other one is more or less the opposite of a fear reaction, which is an anger reaction, which is often... what was it? I heard a great quote sometime in my life. It said that anger is preferable to depression because you get a lot more done.
I think it's maybe that's true, but maybe it's a little reckless, because maybe it just feeds the beast. That's the root of the problem, because a lot of anger drives a lot of it. Fear drives a lot of it ultimately, too. Because these guys, once they have a lot of things and want to keep it, it's fear, too. But when you think about that whole mindset, what does anger eventually shift to? It eventually shifts to some sort of reconciliation and then some affirmative action. And maybe there's the secret of it. When you think about anger or any emotion, once you recognize it, sort of you see it or you notice it, it no longer takes you, but you take it. And then maybe you channel that energy into something more constructive rather than destructive,
Well, I think a lot of our emotional reactions exist for a reason, and sometimes blocking them out isn't the best thing. Sometimes the best thing is finding the reason.
Right. And, I think you experience it, observe it, and then do something with it that changes the game. Because righteous anger is a rare thing. Usually anger is more, based on inconvenience. It's selfish anger, actually. Righteous anger is rare, but when it's there, it's time to convert some energy into making some changes.
Well, there's power in it, and of course, if like all power, if misused, it can be dangerous and deadly. Speaking of which, a recent study has confirmed that the majority of car accidents are caused by anger, psychotropic drugs, and people who are sleep deprived. And this study also included people who were smoking cannabis while driving, and they don't cause accidents at all. And that's probably because they're not angry.
Anger, when you think about it, if you look at an EEG, the brain activity when people are experiencing anger or depression or any of those negative emotions, what you get is incoherent brain patterns, not rhythmic at all. They're kind of all over the map. And they're the ones associated with flight or fight responses. And they're not associated with higher ordered thinking or intellectual thinking. When you see those ordered rhythmic patterns that are associated with that higher ordered thinking, it tends to be slower, more rhythmic. Your breathing tends to go into sync. This is a more focused state of awareness. And when you look at what government does, what the 6 o'clock news does, what the deodorant commercial does is generate fear on some level. And I think that's where, again, the trouble begins. But you fall into this state of flight or fight. You can be hurted, moved, manipulated fairly easily. Again, kind of when you're experiencing those negative emotions, I think you're intended to, I think people should experience the full range of human emotion. And as you do and recognize the root, that's where affirmative or changed action takes place. And, I said to somebody recently, they were talking about this horrible thing that had happened to them. And I said, wow, that's great. And they looked at me like I was out of my mind. And I said, wait a minute, I said, think about it. I said, if you win the lottery, people always say, oh, how lucky you are, what great timing, all these great things. But really, most people who win the lottery end up in misery. And if you follow that whole, story. But if people who actually experience miserable things, which we all do, and anyone who's been around long enough knows they do, those are your opportunities for your greatest growth in life, I think. And so we ought to be cheering at the bottom, not at the top, because where the real happenings are in most people's experience is at the bottom. And I think we forget that. And that's, again, this whole idea of changing fundamentally. If we quit beating ourselves up and start recognizing our opportunities and what we've learned in life, that's where real change can happen. And as we look backwards, as a culture, as a society, and as individuals, we can always see it with 2020.
As they say, a lesson learned is a lesson earned.
Yeah, and the price is high, right? I mean, to get any real wisdom, you're going to pay the price of suffering, right?
That's what Jordan Maxwell told me when I was asking him about what happens to people when they start studying the occult. And he's like, well, you get what you pay for.
Well, that's maybe it. I mean, if you ask for wisdom, you might get a lot of miserable experience in order to accomplish some, right?
I've even started to turn this into my my kind of thing, bro. Whenever I'm feeling really great and really happy, and I've got spare expendable income, and I'm not under stress or anything, that's when I start praying to the gods to mess up my life, just to keep it back into the learning. Speaking of which.
Vincent, it's better to ask for grace, I think, than misery, because you can learn the easy way or the hard way. And I think the easy way is maybe something preferred at some point in life. Maybe you have enough misery to last a lifetime.
Well, I don't know. I think it's a shortcut, and the reason why it's called a shortcut is because if it was easy, it would just be the way. Yeah. My very special guest, ladies and gentlemen, is Dr. Nick Begich, and we will be right back after the break at the VinnyEastwoodShow.com. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Vinny Eastwood Show. Bear in mind this is a listener-supported broadcast, so if you like to keep continuing to hear from interesting people from all around the world, and all of the things that they can really teach you as they teach me at the same time, then please go to the VinnyEastwoodShow.com. That's Vinny with a Y, because it's the most important question, and Eastwood as in go ahead, make my news, and go ahead, make a donation. We especially really appreciate those many, many listeners who have been donating monthly for years. Literally, people have been giving $10 a month, $20 a month, $5 a month, even $1 a month for years and years to keep the show on the air. And I very much want to acknowledge all of you who do that. I almost gets emotional up in here sometimes when I don't even have my bills paid or anything, and then all of those regular things just come in at exactly the right time and pay everything just wham, right like that. You don't have any idea how much you mean to me. My very special guest is Dr. Nick Begich. Hi, Dr. Nick.
Hey, it's good to be back with you.
I hope you're having fun. It's the one tyrannical rule imposed on us by the American Freedom Radio Network, is that we must have fun. Because if we're having fun, the audience is having fun.
Hey, it's always interesting. I've done a lot of radio over the years. I was trying to figure it out one day, and it's something over 3,000 programs, since 1995 when I started reporting on science and technology issues. And, when you look back over a 20-year block of time and you think about where we've come in that time, it is amazing. And as you said at one point in one of the segments earlier, we only see the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, the spear point, that we see, and the rest of it's kind of hidden from public view for decades often. I think that shrinks a little bit too. The technology that we have also connects people in a unique way, allows people to exchange ideas. We can move around the planet so much easier. I mean, you think about air travel as something that's actually, as a relative cost, has gone way down, the ability to move around. I think that's all of that offers an opportunity for significant change. The more people can see, the more you can exchange ideas, the greater the possibility of change, I think, as well.
I find there's a strange phenomenon here. It's shared by doctors, and computer geeks. A constant update system on the current sphere of knowledge, which means you have to be constantly updating, upskilling, and familiarizing yourself with things that only just got discovered a minute ago.
Right. And here's the thing about all that, though, is, when you think about how specialized science is, the opportunity to sort of undo that, where people can go across the disciplines and gather even more knowledge or perspective, if you will, look at the elephant from a different angle. That's where real interesting creative work can happen. And, what we need to see more of is incentivizing sort of the solution side, major prizes, awards, rewards, ways of getting government more accountable and business more sensible, rewards for things that actually improve the human condition, recognizing ways to incentivize some of that, because, think about where inventiveness really comes from. Most of it's not high science in some lab. It's some leap of intuition, a couple bicycle makers deciding an airplane might be an idea that will work out. Somebody sitting in a garage and coming up with a microcomputer or Mr. Coffee or whatever you think your deal was that was so important in life. Most of it, a lot of it was either by perseverance, 1,000 tries to get to the right filament for a light bulb, or some leap of intuition. But
or stealing somebody else's idea, that always works as well.
Yeah, well, that happens too, or modifying someone else's idea, which happens a lot more often. And, each of those things, change the world, so to speak. And there's a lot still left to be done. I think that, I was the sponsor through the Lay Institute of Technology. I hosted a conference, a closed conference on mind effects, the idea of the human brain and what might be possible in the future, and brought together a group of really world-class minds, scientists. And the conclusion that shocked me was the sort of the next evolution of consciousness coming from these people. Their perspective was the leap into anomalous human capabilities, or what used to be referred to as extrasensory perceptions. The idea of these anomalous things that humans happen to do every once in a while. If
You could have an entire television network dedicated to extrasensory perception. Actually, you could call it ESPN.
Yeah, right. But thinking about that again, as a concept, that changes the world, right? I mean, how many of those people does it take to alter the course of humanity? And maybe that's our underlying natural state. In fact, if you stay in a state of fear, whether it's driven by religion, business, politics, doesn't matter, you can't ever reach those higher states of consciousness. That's another fact, because your brain can't hit those window frequencies, if you will, in those states of fear or unconsciousness, if you will.
I remember when I was thinking about quitting my job, the last job I ever had, full-time anyway, I called up a friend of mine who runs a magazine called Uncensored here in New Zealand, talking about all the news that the news doesn't talk about.
Right.
And I asked him, I feel like quitting my job, what should I do? And he says, ask yourself this one question: does it feel right? Sometimes you really do have to trust your instincts, and it'll lead you to a different thing. And you were talking before about how a lot of interesting and innovative inventions have been done by people who weren't qualified or in high science or anything of that nature. And just looking at myself, I don't have any background in filmmaking or talk radio or anything like that, and yet I have over 3,000 YouTube videos just on one account, and more YouTube subscribers than the largest mainstream media YouTube channel equivalent, New Zealand Herald TV, here in New Zealand. And I've accomplished that in less than a decade. In fact, I accomplished that by the year 2012. And it just seems to me that when people have the mistaken idea that you need qualifications, that you need approval, that you need a team of people to help you, that you need XXYZ amount of things in order to do or start anything at all. That misconception is what stops them from doing anything. Somebody was telling me before about how I don't know anything about computers and I don't know anything about video editing. He's a qualified video editor. And I said, bro, how many videos you made? He says 2. I said, bro, I've made 3,000.
Yeah.
The qualification does not make one competent.
No, and you know what I would say to that too is people need to just do. To act on what they know, and not have to rely on someone else's approval. I had this conversation recently as well with a group of people in Oregon. I took my youngest child on road trips every once in a while. She's 8, and in the course of that, she gets to meet a lot of my friends. And one of the conversations was about exactly this. It was a 28-year teacher who had retired that wanted to write a children's book, but on more than, the normal children's story, something deeper than that. And she couldn't get started. Fear of criticism was what was stopping her, actually. And we had this long conversation. I said, hey, is it fear or is it love? I said, you did 28 years with elementary school kids. Did you love it? Did you like it? You had to have. And she goes, yeah, I loved it. It was great, I said, well, just go back there in your head, in your consciousness, and write that, and quit worrying about what I'm going to think about or somebody else in this room. I said, because it's not your audience anyway. It's going to be kids, so write it for them, do it, and you'll do it. And I think that's it. Find the passion in what you do and do that. Try, make the effort. And then you'll find that you'll make a living at it. But if you do the other way around, where you're fearful about not making a living, I think that's when you start to lose perspective. Find your passion, figure out a way to make a living at it, I think is a better model for fulfilling something that you're driven to. And you don't need credentials to do that. You need perseverance. I would say.
As like Gerald Celente said, a passionate employee is the person who will stay after hours until the job is done. A passionate employee will learn things that he doesn't have to learn or never even really occurred to him to learn in order to make the job easier and better and improved in some way. If you have a passion for what you're doing, if you're not just there because you have to be, if you're not just some kind of slave that's compelled by the current social order, you will change things. However, if you're going into a corporate structure, you'll find very quickly that your original ideas to change and improve things aren't that much appreciated, son.
Hey, you know what? I agree with that. Fundamentally, I do. And in those instances, consider them stops between interviews, if you will, and apply that creativity when you flip the switch off from that job and walk out the door each night in some other thing that you are driven to. Because, you know, the tinkerer at night also, whether it's intellectually or physically, mechanically, or in some other way, you know, that's a lot of fulfillment happens there, and a lot of creativity happens there as well. You know, Einstein worked in the patent office when he published his most important papers because he had, after all, had to have a job. But, you know, do what you do at some point in the day. And that was my message to that 28-year retired teacher, was just do 30 minutes a day of it. You know, if everything else gets in the way, at least give it that. You know, and I say that in terms of following your passion. You know, people say, how do you wait for an organization to begin? You know, you're already in it. You know, it's called the human race. Just act on what you know to be right and true, and actually act on what you believe you can get done. Because too many people, I think, set themselves up for failure by jumping into something they don't believe they can get done in the first place. Do what you know you can do and step into that. The next thing will show itself. I really believe that.
Yeah, I think the reason they call it the human race is because nobody wants to come last.
No, but you know what? We're all on the same trajectory, right? You can go to the doctor and they'll say, oh man, you're going to die. But when you tell your friends, the real story might be in 50 years, you know, but the point is the same.
Well, there's a differential here. It's like, in life, there are clearly defined successes, and those things that you're very simple things, doing what you love and making a living for it, there are very clearly defined successes. Whereas they're all very, very different for everybody.
Right.
But there's also a very clearly defined loss, as in you didn't fulfill your potential in your life, and that is more or less similar for everybody.
Yeah, I think so. I think everyone's potential should be attempted at least. You know what I mean? I mean, even if you fail at it, at least attempt it a few times in life, and take the risk. And you know, that's really the spice of it, isn't it? And the fact that you're still standing and still breathing, obviously the risk wasn't too great, you know, I mean, after all. And, you know, time and experience, I don't know. I've had some really great experiences in my life. I've had some very difficult times. I wouldn't trade any of them, quite frankly, not one of them.
Well, it's convenient that you can't.
Well, you know, you can't, absolutely. And how it drives you forward, I think that's the fundamental thing. You know, what do you do about what you see in the world? And, you know, radio, I've done a lot of radio, I've done a lot of lecturing, done a lot of things. But, you know, ultimately, when I think about what drives change, it's how we use our technology, which is really how do we use our intellects and how do we blend that with a humanity that values certain things in common. Freedom, liberty, what does that mean in the 21st century? And how do we maintain that? I think that's a question that a lot of people are answering, or asking at least, maybe not answering so well. And you know, I think the world has the opportunity to change. You know, when you think about corruption, how much that takes the wind out of possibilities, whether it's government or companies or whatever. You know, a way to address that would sure change and level the playing field an awful lot.
It's kind of like vitamin C for the immune system to a large degree, and if you were to think about it in terms of a viral infection, in humanity, it's simply a lack of nutrition, really.
Yes.
Intellectual nutrition, spiritual nutrition, that kind of jazz is basically what's happened. We're infected with some kind of a nonchalant, stagnant cancer of scumbaggery that is basically sucking all the nutrients out of society and preventing us, the human body, from protecting itself against this attack.
I think that's fair to say. I mean, on a lot of levels, that's the outcome, right? I mean, that's a pretty graphic way to view it, but I mean, that is the outcome, isn't it? You know, when you think about how widely and dispersed and despairing the economies of the world are, as an example, or governments and the way they function. But at the same time, I think people are entitled to self-determination. Or within political boundaries, you know, you can force change or not. You know, you can acquiesce and have some kind of culture based on some religion or some political belief or philosophy. Fine with me. I think that's what we've missed in the world is, you know, people can have self-determination even if it's not our brand. You know what I mean? And I think leaving it alone is maybe the greater challenge in the 21st century, and allowing people a right of self-determination on some fundamental basis if they want to be whatever they want to be, and try and do that in a way that doesn't jeopardize boundaries and, you know, and keep us out of some of this stuff. Ultimately, it's about values, right? I mean, people want to have religious wars over what? That God can't do the job of killing? You know, he doesn't need any help. You know, who's so arrogant to think God needs help killing a bunch of human beings?
I was just thinking about this, like, all of the crimes that are being committed are already illegal. We don't need any laws. We need enforcement of those laws. I mean, for F's sake, why hasn't anybody figured this out? If there's certain people above the law, then the law itself means nothing. And all the stability that it's supposed to provide, all of the smooth running wheels on which our society is built, grind to a halt. And that is what we are experiencing on a global level. A complete and utter lack of enforcement.
Yeah, you know, and think about it from this perspective. A law library in the U.S. is about 3 floors high and just, you know, a lot of square meters of space, you know. And it ought to be down to a book that you ought to be able to carry under one arm at least, you know. Because the law should be simple enough that then the rest is an interpretation of a jury, right? I mean, how complicated do we need it? And yet that's what we've done. We've created a complicated system of justice in virtually every country that's so complicated the average man can't get any.
They say it's like, bro, if ignorance of the law is of no excuse, then why do you pass laws without reading them?
Yeah.
And pass so many of them.
Yeah, and not only that, but when you think about it at the local, state, national level and international level, and the layering of it all, it should be much simpler. And maybe that's the answer, you know, is to simplify it and allow a little more discretion by juries. And wasn't that the original intention anyway? And now it's this complicated game that everybody has to, even attorneys, you know, it's like they're as specialized as the podiatrist that you wouldn't let do brain surgery just because they both have doctor before their name, right? You know, and the law is just as complex. I mean, when you stop and think about it, and it shouldn't be. It should be much more straightforward, and justice ought to be accessible, and you ought not to have to be rich to get a measure of it. And that is not justice, and that is not measurable. Yeah. And that is the injustice of it, isn't it?
In my opinion, the law of the jungle is a system based upon injustice. He said, she said, I take, I kill, or be killed, and or be taken from, whereas real justice is an artificial composite that we are capable of inflicting. Really. It's actually quite a beautiful thing when you think about it, that we can defy the laws of nature itself and truly correct some of that unnatural mistake of our own human nature. My very special guest is Dr. Nick Begich, coming at us from Alaska, with nobody around for 10 bazillion miles, apart from a couple of Predator drones. We'll be right back. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the final segment of the Vinnie Eastwood Show, broadcasting on AmericanFreedomRadio.com 4 days a week, from Monday through Thursday. And it's quite nice, actually, being on regularly. It's almost like a daily bowel movement. And my very special guest is Dr. Nick Begich. Dr. Nick, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me again.
Now, we have just a final segment here to wrap up. And I did, in fact, want to ask you what your early life was like, because all of us have kind of like a wake-up story when certain people come into our lives, maybe at certain times, and they influence us in a number of really wonderful ways and change sometimes the direction of our lives. Were you, by chance, at one point, like me in my early 20s, when I was just kind of like, enjoying everything, thought everything was fine, was honest with police officers, voted for political parties and things like that without a second thought and thinking it was a great part? Or has this always been a reality that you've had to deal with your whole life?
Well, I grew up in a political family, as a young person, and at 14, just before my 14th birthday, my father vanished as a U.S. congressman just before Watergate during a really difficult time in our history and under unusual conditions. And it was a vanishing because they never found the plane or the bodies or the anything. And maybe 20 years later, there was some evidence that actually there may have been knowledge of this plane wreck and where it was, and people survived and so on. But laying that aside for a minute, the idea that death can come in a way where you really don't know it. It's sort of a lingering thing because you don't have certainty. Probably similar to people's sense of a missing in action scenario in a war, where you never get a finality to it. So, that changes you. And I would say that my father's vanishing was that moment, that change moment. As negative as it was, probably the most positive outcome for me. And my mom was 34. She had 6 children, 4 to 14. My sister was a year older than I was at the time. So pretty, I would say that was it. And that made me realize that life is short and that you should apply yourself to what you can do. And then I did.
Did you have like a succession of mentors like I did, or was it mostly self-education?
Yeah, both, I think, because I tended then at that point to associate generally with professionals in areas that I was interested in, and they tended to be, 20 years my senior. And, those friends I kept through life, and now many of them, are in their 70s and 80s and have passed on. So, but I've had some really excellent associations and relationships with people over my lifetime that I would say all are pretty strong mentoring relationships. When I think about it, that's the essence of it, isn't it? Your friends and your relationships.
Well, I think that they really do come with you to a large degree, and you never forget them. It reminds me of something that Arnold Schwarzenegger said. He said, once you achieve some kind of success in your life, the onus on you is to give something back.
Yeah, and I think when you've had a lot of mentoring personalities. I mean, I look at starting. I've learned a lot about death. Starting with my dad's. And in this last 10 years, 30 of my friends and relatives have passed away in the last 10 years. That's a lot of people. And I still have a lot of friends and relatives around, which is a nice thing as well. But, when you experience that and you think about taking a piece of each of those people with you, that's truly how people live on, I think, through your experiences with other people and what you learn from them. And mentoring personalities, reading. I'm self-taught a lot of some of the most brilliant people I've met are self-taught. And, people put way too much, I think, on credentialing, following your interest and then pursuing it passionately. And whether it's in your professional life, if you can make it into a livelihood, your work, that's better. If you can't, at least make sure you express your livelihood and what you do the rest of your life. And I think people can and do. When you talk about reaching potentials, ultimately, I think that's what we're all here to do, reach some potential, our next best version of whatever we are, and apply what we experience in some meaningful way. And that's when I think of technology and what it offers. There's some great things that have come of technology. We all can point to them. It's really, again, gets back to intentionality. We have the opportunity now in this century to solve some of the most complex problems, create abundance in a way we never have before. I think that's pretty amazing, and that's a lot to look forward to in the midst of what has otherwise been a dark last century when you think about it.
Well, what you were saying before about how other people live on through you and your memories, it reminds me of how a hologram works. You can't delete the information off the hologram, you can only make it a little fuzzier because the information is always stored somewhere.
Right. And actually that holographic universal concept of reality, which is really one that some physicists have played with over the years, and it's this idea that within each thing is a reflection of all things, that universal connectivity. Imagine that as a root to all that is, and some believe that is that root. When you think about an outward expression of creation itself, as expressed in most religious thinking, it's just created in the image of a creator. Is that a holographic universe? What does that mean? Really?
Some take it too far and say, oh, this is all just a projection, it doesn't mean anything, it's just a subjective experience. It's like, well, look at it this way. Your effect on the universe is unique in that you can take things that don't exist at all and nobody's ever thought of, and will them or build them into existence.
Yeah.
And in so doing, you affect the physical universe.
Yeah. That's a good way of looking at it. At the same time, you're a cell within that physical universe, and you start taking them away, and things don't look so good in real short order. It's all about that, isn't it? And I think we each get the opportunity to do some pretty remarkable things. And what I've always said is do something that furthers what you believe in is right and true. In the last 20 years, I've done a lot on technologies, a lot in the sciences, a lot of public reporting, and then a lot of other projects that most people aren't even paying attention to. But what I would say is in doing that, it's been both rewarding and fulfilling. And I would not have guessed 20 years ago that I would have been doing all these things any more than I think you would have 20 years ago. And it's stepping into it, in a little bit at a time. Do what you're passionate about. Don't be so afraid about criticism and those things. Just, but be honest, be true to yourself, recognize when you've made error and fix it and move on from it. And that's the spice of life, I think, more than anything else. And try not to create too much damage along the way is always a good idea.
I think both you and I have benefited from a rather early experience in our lives of trauma and loss. In so doing, those other people who literally did think 20, 30 years ahead and are still at the same job, never had. And their perception of comfort was never broken. And sometimes it is through great loss and great trauma that you realize how little protection the veil of perception gives you when something really happens.
Well, and here's something else, is what's big and what's small. You can say, those were big ones, but here's what I do know is any effort taken is one worth doing, because it could be the simplest of things. When you think about walking down the road and you smile at someone and you don't recognize, but maybe they were off to blow their head off and they didn't because of that smile. And instead, they went off and in the next 10 years cured some rare cancer. Now, did you do it by the smile, or did they do it by doing 10 years worth of whatever? What was the catalyst for change? You never know what it is. So I don't think they're small or big things. They're just kind of things that you get to do.
It's more like a contribution, like 100 different chefs come by and toss a different ingredient in the soup.
Yeah, and I think, sometimes we underestimate what we've done, and there are no small things in my estimation. They're just things done with good intention, and everyone can do something about what they care about with passion and find the joy in doing it and not the fear in it, not the impossibility of it, but find the joy in it. And that's where things fundamentally start to change. And I think that's, again, gets back to this thing about, we can talk about the HARP, or we can talk about mind control technology or privacy technology, generate a lot of fear about all that. Or we can say, yeah, we know that stuff exists, but fundamentally, how do we change the fact that it can exist? How do we change the way we see the world, and how do we change it? How do we alter our consciousness about it and redirect the path of humanity maybe a little different direction, so we don't destroy this place that's capable of doing very well by all of us?
Sometimes it's about understanding the problem before proposing the solution. Because if you never understood the problem in the first place, how great is any solution you could come up with?
Yeah, sure. I agree with that totally. And I think more and more people see it, from different ends, whether it's they see the economic hardship or the environmental or whatever it is. But I think that's what I see in the world maybe now, as we hit some sort of coming into a critical mass where people will start to say, hey, wait a minute, enough is enough, and push against what is, the established order. And that's the way it happens. And I think we're in that revolutionary thinking again that cycles through our cultures and societies from time to time. And, we're in that change period where we feel a lot of unrest in the world, and we see it manifest in a lot of different ways. Will we shake it out the same way we always have? Let's hope we do a better job than just killing each other over it, whatever it is that we're doing.
I think a great author once said that democracy is kind of like a stew. If you don't have somebody in there to stir it up every once in a while, you get a layer of scum that builds up on the top.
Yeah, it's probably true. Yeah, that's true. I think you say that about every government, and look at, it's, people are more transparent now than they ever have been too, by virtue of this same technology that's made us vulnerable. So how do we alter the course in a more humane way? I think we can. I remain an optimist, or I wouldn't do this work, and I'm sure you feel the same way. And I think you do have to have a sense of humor about it. Take it too seriously, you can't think if you're in fear. So
yeah, man. I mean, look, it's just the end of the world.
Well, people have been saying that since the beginning of time. So maybe it is, and maybe it isn't. And let's do what we do, and maybe we reconstruct it in a little more constructive way, and it isn't the end of the world.
Yeah.
If you lived in Bombay, what they used to call Bombay in India, or you lived in Bangladesh or some places in the world, you'd swear that you were in Armageddon for the last 2,000 years, because these are some hard places to live. It's all relative, when you think about it.
The British conquered them all with the cunning use of flags. I claim this for Britain, but hold on a second, we've got 1 billion people living here.
Yeah, right.
We've been here for thousands of years. Do you have a flag?
And a gun?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit of elbow grease and a musket, there ain't much you can't accomplish. Yeah, Dr. Nick Begich, thank you very much for joining us on the Vinnie Eastwood Show. It's been very enjoyable. I love talking about my enslavement and various forms of perversions of privacy, and also very nasty covert technologies. But I like more hearing about how people have managed to make lemonade out of lemons.
Hey, I appreciate being with you, Vincent. We'll do it again sometime.
Indeedy do, and thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for listening in. Dr. Nick, do you have a website of some description?
I do. It's earthpulse.com, EARTHPULSE, earthpulse.com.
Earthpulse.com, earthpulse.com, earthpulse.com. Apparently, if you repeat it 3 times, people will remember it a little bit better. And just remember, ladies and gentlemen, the VinnyEastwoodshow.com is where you can find me, and contact pages and Facebook links and all of that kind of stuff, and crappy memes and terrible puns, bad jokes, the whole 9 yards, everything you love at the VinnyEastwoodshow.com. And just remember, of course, that this is a survival effort, so if you donate a couple of dollars a month, we'd also very much appreciate that too. Let's hope humanity is not doomed, and the only way to get to a bit of freedom is together. Thank you very much. We'll see you again sometime.
When you look at science and sort of the impact of science on modern culture and society, you know, the impact is pretty much as predicted. I think there's symptomatic. You know, whether you look at environmental problems or military issues or political issues, underlying all that is really the issue of consciousness. I guess where people, how we view the world, how we interact with each other, and ultimately that, I think, becomes the problem and maybe the solution. Everything else seems symptomatic of that.
I was having an argument. Oh, there seemed to be a bit of feedback. If you could perhaps turn your speakers down a little. If you just turn the volume down on them, it should solve the problem. Earlier, before the show, I was having an argument with a listener about the whole enemies and friends business. And I believe that there are true enemies to humanity, and there's a burden of responsibility upon those people who recognize it to go out and oppose them in order to protect everybody else, as it were. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, on a certain level, I think there's certain elements that get pretty reckless, so kind of containing the recklessness might be a way of looking at it. But ultimately, I think, again, you know, when you start thinking about these kinds of problems, they're symptomatic of really a lack of awareness, consciousness, really thinking about what we're doing and the impact of it. And a lot of it, you know, unfortunately, a lot of the destruction is sort of, I guess, driven by religion and driven by greed, if you really want to get down to it.
Would you say it's kind of like that triple partnership between London controlling the money, the Vatican controlling the ecclesiastical power, and the United States controlling the military? Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to yet another exciting episode of the Vinny Eastwood Show. It's the lighter side of genocide, because after all, just because we're being exterminated doesn't mean we can't make it fun. Otherwise, what's the point of being killed? My very special guest is Dr. Nick Begich, and I wanted to make the kind of a Simpsons joke, you know, get the whole audience. Hi, Dr. Nick! Welcome to the show, my friend.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening.
Now, this show might be a little bit different to the very serious broadcast that you may have been associated with previously. It's mostly just a conversation between two people, and the audience basically just gets to listen in. The one thing I'm really interested in hearing from you is sort of your origin story, how you got going, what your life has been like, the whole 9 yards. Start wherever you wish.
Well, that's kind of a broad question. Well, you know, in terms of sciences, the last, I guess since '95, we've been talking about new technologies, privacy-related technologies. HARP was a big part of some of our original writing, but a lot of work in the sciences, just acting as, I think, more of a reporter than anything else, and compiling sort of the direction of science, where it was headed. And over the years, I think we've been proven pretty right on most of our projections.
And does it make you feel better or worse knowing that you're right?
Well, I think, in the conclusion of it all, I think
That those three elements have more or less brought humanity into a very dark fold.
Well, I think you can say that, but I think if you look at all religion, I mean, on one level or another, contains the elements of the same things. Government, whether it's the U.S. or other governments, contain elements of the same thing. And banking or moneyed interest, or the medium between exchanges, and how that gets regulated, and sort of the arbitrage in that by corporations or other moneyed interest. If you think about it, the titles change over time, but the interests really don't change a whole lot. When you think about it, whether it's, whatever caused the revolution, whether it was a few hundred years ago, a few thousand years ago, or tomorrow, you know what I mean? I mean, it seems to drive by the same thing. So the Vatican holds huge power. U.S. in terms of military power dwarfs everyone else. Although, if you really think about it, maybe that's not so, or won't be so for very long, because a lot of that is driven by an analysis of sort of expenditures. The U.S. spends so much more money than everyone else. But if you look at it from the standpoint of what do you get for that money? I mean, what do you get in output? And I think that's maybe a better measure. So measure outputs in finished ships and military readiness, say from China compared to the U.S., and you get about a 10-to-1 difference in terms of outward productivity in terms of hardware from China, as an example.
Well, if you're talking about these negative influence on society, I'm thinking about a common thread here. It's in exchange for blind belief, you're supposed to get power. Right?
Well, maybe that's so. I think a lot of it's driven by fear, if you think about the right questions in that environment, and they're expected to regulate it. I mean, it's like, how do you do that? I mean, and I don't think you can under that circumstance, and that's the circumstance that the U.S. government's under, which leads sort of the charge on technologies with nobody in the Senate or Congress to speak of with enough depth in science to really even ask the right questions.
This reminds me of the politically naive reporters who ask the president questions during press conferences.
Right. The same thing, if you don't have a good basis, you can't ask the right questions, right? So, who gets in the room and gets to ask is always sort of the outcome of bad reporting. But again, going back to technology, when you think about the temptation, and this is where, again, I think the politics and the money rub up against maybe what's in the best human interest, and that's that idea of control. When you think about what now you can do with information, virtually everything is connected. Your financial, your health, your voting, just think of all the electronic records that surround one individual over a lifetime that can be collated and indexed and reviewed and thought about, from your phone calls to your digital connections. And when you think about that in the terms of politics, what is going to happen and is happening is as the resolution, if you will, as the intensity of the resolution gets better, you can deduce more and more about average people or individual people within a population. And then you can tailor your political messages, and this is where it's headed and where it is. Tailor it to an individual where you got 100 issues and there's only one that you're going to agree on with that individual. The other 99 you don't. But you can bring your messaging in, so that's the only message about it, whether it's religion driving the fear or government driving the fear, but that becomes maybe blind belief or sort of the flight and fight response. Maybe that's a way of looking at it.
Well, what was it? Sacrificing your liberties in exchange for security, and you often wind up with neither.
Right, exactly right. In fact, I think you do wind up with neither, because ultimately your liberty and your personal freedom, there's a certain insecurity in that, if you will. There's certain uneasiness or natural tension sort of built into that. I think.
It's implying that there's natural risk in life anyway.
Yeah, I think that's it. And, but when you look at, sort of the intentionality behind a lot of the military things that I've reported on over the years, a lot of it is about control and manipulation and those things. And when you think about government and what it's become, it's so, different than what I think anybody envisioned. When you lay technology on top of government or anything. And when you think about technology in terms of power, just raw power, what makes governments powerful in the 21st century really is technology, if you think about it, command and control of technology. So when you think about that as a concept, how many people in government really have knowledge of that at a level where they can regulate it properly?
This is why they have panels of advisors who incidentally represent all the technology companies that are coming up with this stuff that kills people.
Right. Well, not only that, but in Congress, they get closed committee hearings, right? They get briefed by Pentagon people and people on the inside. They can't take advisors. They can't take aides. They can't make notes. They can't discuss it with anyone outside of the room. So how does a non-scientist even ask